Don't mind Grandpa, he naps a lot these days. Just let him rest, my granddaughter Emma told her new boyfriend at Sunday dinner, patting my shoulder gently as I dozed in my recliner in the corner of the living room. The conversation and laughter continuing around me like I was simply part of the furniture, rather than someone actively listening to every word being said about him. My name is Corporal Walter Simmons, United States Army, retired, though by that particular Sunday, almost nobody at that table thought of me as anything beyond the quiet, sleepy old man who dozed through most family gatherings these days. I was 81 years old, and I'd stopped correcting people's assumptions about my naps years earlier, mostly because there was something genuinely restful about being underestimated, about letting the family's affectionate, slightly dismissive narrative about Grandpa's naps simply exist without complication. I need to explain how an entire family arrives at a shared, comfortable story about their oldest member that happens to be almost entirely beside the point. I served in the Army during a specific, difficult period of conflict in my early 20s, part of a small, specialized unit whose particular operations during that era remained largely undocumented in any popular or widely known way for decades afterward. The kind of units whose contributions existed mostly in classified records and the private memories of the dwindling number of us who'd actually served together, rather than in any book or documentary the general public would have ever encountered. The nature of the missions we conducted required a specific kind of secrecy that outlasted the operations themselves by decades, not because any of us particularly wanted it that way, but because the sensitivity of certain operational details meant most records remained sealed long after the war itself had ended, and long after most of us had built entirely ordinary civilian lives on top of memories we simply couldn't discuss with anyone outside our small circle. I lost several close friends during that period, men whose names meant nothing to anyone outside our unit for decades, their sacrifices existing only in the private grief of the handful of us who remembered them clearly. I came home from that service quietly, the way a lot of men from my specific era and unit did, into a country that, at the time, wasn't especially interested in hearing detailed accounts from returning veterans of that particular conflict. I built an ordinary life afterward, married my wife Dorothy, worked 38 years as an electrician, raised 2 children, and eventually became grandfather to 5 grandchildren who knew me almost entirely as the mild, quiet old man who showed up to dinners, gave modest but thoughtful gifts, and in recent years increasingly dozed off in whatever comfortable chair happened to be nearby. The napping itself wasn't entirely a performance, I should say, being honest about it. At 81, genuine fatigue is simply a fact of daily life, and I do actually rest more than I used to. But I'll admit there was also something protective in how readily I let the family's narrative about my naps become the entire, uncomplicated story of who I was at these gatherings. A comfortable cover that meant nobody expected much conversation from me, nobody asked probing questions, and I could simply exist quietly at the edges of family life without the effort of explaining a chapter of my history that had never felt like it belonged at a Sunday dinner table anyway. My grandchildren, Emma included, grew up with an even thinner version of this same understanding, essentially just, Grandpa was in the Army a long time ago, a fact roughly as significant in their daily awareness as knowing I'd once owned a particular model of car decades before they were born. The napping, in more recent years, had simply become the dominant, defining characteristic they associated with me at family gatherings, overshadowing whatever thin awareness of my actual service history had ever existed in the first place. I don't think this happened through any particular failure on anyone's part. Families settle into whatever narrative requires the least friction, and Grandpa Naps a Lot required considerably less friction than any honest accounting of a war most of my grandchildren had never even studied in school, a conflict that, by the time they were born, had already receded into the kind of distant historical footnote that gets a single paragraph in a textbook, rather than any real, felt understanding of what it had actually cost the people who lived through it. The shift happened on an entirely ordinary Tuesday evening, a few months ago, when a regional news program aired a special historical segment marking an upcoming anniversary related to the specific conflict I'd served in,
part of a broader series the station was running featuring local veterans and previously undocumented aspects of that era's military operations. The segment focused specifically on my old unit, whose activities during that period had, over recent years, gradually become the subject of new historical research and partial declassification, allowing journalists and historians access to records that had simply not existed publicly during most of my adult life. I hadn't known this particular segment was airing. I found out, along with the rest of my family, when Emma called her mother in a state of visible excitement, having stumbled across the broadcast while scrolling through the station's website looking for something else entirely, and recognizing with a jolt my own unit designation mentioned specifically in the segment's description. The family gathered around Susan's laptop that same evening, an impromptu viewing that I wasn't initially part of, having gone home earlier after that week's Sunday dinner before any of this unfolded. Susan called me that night, her voice carrying an unusual mixture of excitement and something more complicated, something closer to the specific disorientation of realizing you fundamentally misunderstood a person you thought you knew completely.
The segment, as it turned out, included interview footage with a military historian who had spent several years researching my unit's specific operations, drawing on newly accessible archival material to piece together an account of missions that had never received any real public attention or acknowledgement during all the decades since. The historian described in some detail the nature of the operations my unit had conducted, characterizing the work as extraordinarily high risk and significant to broader strategic outcomes during that period. The kind of assessment that, hearing it secondhand from my own daughter over the phone, struck me as almost describing someone else entirely rather than my own remembered experience of simply doing an extremely difficult job as a young man alongside people I cared about deeply. Susan told me the segment included a list of unit members whose names had recently been more fully documented as part of this new historical research, and that my name had appeared on screen, spelled correctly, associated directly with the specific missions the historian was describing, in such serious, weighted terms. She said she'd had to pause the video and simply sit with it for several minutes before she could bring herself to call me, needing time to reconcile the man being described on screen with the quiet, napping grandfather she'd grown up alongside her entire life. I want to be honest that hearing all this secondhand over the phone produced a strange, disorienting feeling rather than anything like pride or vindication. Decades of quiet, private memory, carried largely alone or shared only with the shrinking circle of men who'd actually been there with me, suddenly existing as researched, documented, publicly broadcast historical fact felt less like recognition and more like watching a private grief become unexpectedly public property. The following Sunday dinner was different from any that had come before it. Emma arrived early, practically vibrating with a mixture of excitement and visible embarrassment, apologizing repeatedly for the grandpa naps a lot comment from weeks earlier, though I told her honestly there was nothing to apologize for, since she'd simply been operating on the only information she'd ever actually been given. David and Susan had watched the full segment multiple times by that point, and came prepared with actual questions, specific ones, informed by what the historian had described, rather than the vague, general curiosity they might have expressed in years past. Several neighbors and extended family friends had apparently seen the broadcast too, and Susan mentioned fielding a handful of calls throughout the week from people wanting to confirm whether the Walter Simmons mentioned was actually her father. Calls that left her, by her own admission, having to explain a version of my history she herself was still absorbing in real time. I found myself, for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, actually discussing details of that period with my own family. Not everything. There remain specific moments I still keep entirely to myself, likely permanently, but considerably more than I'd ever previously volunteered. I want to describe honestly that this wasn't an entirely comfortable experience. Being suddenly publicly documented after decades of quiet privacy stirred up memories I'd spent a long time keeping carefully at a manageable distance. Dorothy, sitting beside me through much of that dinner, later told me she'd noticed me needing more quiet moments than usual in the days following, processing something that the sudden public attention had unexpectedly reopened. Dorothy herself had known the fuller picture for all our decades of marriage, one of the only people who had, and she told me, during one of those quiet evenings that week, that she'd sometimes wondered over the years whether keeping it so entirely private had been the right choice, or whether some part of our children's and grandchildren's relationship with me had been quietly incomplete because of it. She didn't say this accusingly, just thoughtfully, the kind of observation a spouse of 50-some years earns the right to make gently. I told her I honestly didn't know the answer myself, that the choice to stay quiet had felt necessary for so long that questioning it now, at 81, felt strange,
like reconsidering a decision so old it had become part of the architecture of who I was rather than something I'd actually chosen deliberately each day since.
But there was something valuable in it too, something I hadn't fully anticipated. My grandchildren, Emma especially, began asking questions with a specificity and genuine interest that felt entirely different from the polite, surface-level curiosity of previous years. She asked to see photographs I hadn't looked at myself in years, pulled from a box in my closet that Dorothy retrieved without my initially realizing what she was doing. She asked about specific names the historian had mentioned, wanting to understand not just the broad historical significance, but the actual, specific human relationships involved, the men I'd served alongside, which of them were still living, which weren't. We spent an entire afternoon, the two of us, going through that box together, Emma photographing several of the older pictures on her phone, asking permission before each one, treating them with a careful reverence that surprised me, given how casually she'd previously treated the entire subject of my service. She asked if she could research a few of the names herself, curious whether any of the men I'd mentioned had families of their own she might be able to track down, an idea that hadn't occurred to me in decades of simply carrying those names privately in memory. Emma's boyfriend, present again for this particular Sunday dinner, approached me with a noticeably different demeanor than his first visit weeks earlier, when I'd simply been the napping old man in the corner recliner. He'd apparently watched the news segment himself after Emma mentioned it, and asked me several thoughtful, well-informed questions throughout the evening, treating me, for the first time since I'd met him, as someone worth genuinely engaging with rather than politely working around. He mentioned, almost shyly, that his own grandfather had served during a later conflict and had passed away several years earlier without ever discussing much about it either, and that watching my family's week unfold had made him wish he'd pushed harder, while there was still time, to understand his own grandfather's history before it became permanently unavailable to ask about. I still nap at family dinners now, more often than not, because 81 years genuinely does come with real fatigue that no amount of renewed family attention changes. But something has shifted in how those naps get framed, at least among the people who know better now. Emma, a few weeks ago, gently corrected a visiting cousin who made an offhand comment about Grandpa's naps in the same dismissive tone she herself had once used, explaining, with a kind of protective pride I hadn't expected from her, exactly who I actually was and what those naps had nothing to do with. If you've ever let a comfortable, simplified story about yourself become the entire truth people believe, mostly because correcting it felt like more effort than it was worth, I hope you hear this. Sometimes the full truth finds its way to the people who love you through entirely unexpected channels, a historian's research, a news broadcast, a chance discovery, arriving decades later than it perhaps should have, but still, somehow, exactly when it was finally needed most. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to actually look past the nap and ask what the rest of the story might be.